My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 28 years old. On the morning of my wedding, nearly 200 guests were standing outside the gate of the farm where the ceremony was supposed to take place, and they discovered the gate was locked. There were no flowers, no tables, no music. The venue manager only said one thing very calmly: the wedding contract had been canceled. My phone started vibrating non-stop. Messages from guests, from relatives, from friends. Everyone was asking the same question: what is going on? But the strange thing was, I had never canceled my own wedding. None of us had done that. Yet piece by piece the wedding was disappearing with unsettling precision, as if someone had been quietly dismantling everything step by step. And when I started tracing back what had happened during the 3 weeks before the wedding, I realized this was not a mistake. And to understand why my wedding had turned into something this strange, I had to go back to the night Jake proposed to me. My proposal did not happen under candlelight or in a fancy restaurant. It happened in Jake Carter's repair garage, surrounded by the smell of engine oil and the sound of metal still warm after a long day of work. That night, the garage was already closed. The rolling door was almost completely down. Only a few yellow bulbs were hanging from the ceiling. I was sitting on a wooden chair beside Jake's workbench, halfway through a can of soda. Jake was standing with his back to me, putting his tools away. He set a wrench down on the table, wiped his hands with an old rag, then looked at me for a few seconds. Jake said, "Natalie, can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." Jake stepped a little closer. He was still holding a small, dark blue box in his hand. I looked at the box, and then back at him. I said, "Jake, if you are about to give me a commemorative bolt, I might be a little disappointed." I said, "I know." He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple, but beautiful. Jake looked straight at me and said, "Natalie Brooks, will you marry me?" I looked at him for a few seconds. There was no music, no audience, only the slow hum of the ventilation fan turning above us. I said yes. Jake let out a long breath like he had just finished the hardest job of the day. He smiled and said, "Good. That means I do not have to return this ring." I held out my hand so he could put the ring on my finger. I said, "You just proposed to me in a repair garage." Jake said, "I know, but at least it is my garage." We sat down at the workbench and started talking about the wedding like two people planning a serious project. I opened the notes app on my phone. I said, "First, we need the guest list. If we include both sides of the family and close friends, it will probably be around 200 people." Jake raised an eyebrow but still nodded. He said, "If it is 200 people, then we need to find a place big enough." I said, "I know a small wedding farm outside Colorado Springs. They have a renovated wooden barn that works as a reception hall and a lawn that looks out toward the mountains." Jake said, "That sounds good." I asked what kind of budget would make sense. Jake thought for a few seconds and said he thinks around $18,000. I wrote that number into my phone. I said, "So that is 200 guests, an $18,000 budget, and a wedding farm outside the city." Jake looked at the screen on my phone and said, "That already sounds like a real plan." I said, "Because it actually is a real plan." Then I said I should call my mom and tell her. Jake leaned against the workbench and said, "Go ahead." I dialed my mother's number and put the call on speaker. She answered fairly quickly. She said, "Natalie, is that you?" I said, "Yes, Mom." I told her I have some news I want to share with you. She asked what kind of news. I glanced over at Jake and said, "Jake proposed to me tonight." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother asked one question. "Are you sure you are ready for this?" I stood there quietly for a few seconds. I said, "I think I am ready." My mother did not say much more after that. She only said, "We will talk about it more later," and wished me a good night. The call ended rather quickly. I placed the phone back on the table. Jake was still standing there. He had clearly heard my mother's question. I said, "My mom is always a little cautious." Jake nodded but did not say anything for a few seconds. Then he said very calmly, "Natalie, I have a feeling this might not be as simple as we think." I asked him why he would say that. Jake shrugged. He said, "When a mother hears that her daughter is getting married and the first thing she asks is whether her daughter is sure, usually there are a lot of things behind that question that have not been said yet." I looked down at the ring on my hand. At that moment, I thought Jake was just worrying too much. I told him everything will be fine. Jake did not argue. He simply nodded slightly. But later, I realized that from that very night he had already sensed something that I had not yet noticed. I thought my mother's question that night was just her usual caution. But only a few days later, I began to understand that the story had already started moving in a different direction. Everything began with a family dinner that weekend. Jake and I had been engaged for less than a week. We went to my Aunt Karen's house in northern Colorado Springs. When we walked into the living room, a few relatives were already sitting around the dining table. Aunt Karen hugged me, and then looked down at the ring on my hand. She said, "I heard you are getting married." I smiled and said yes. But right after that, she said something that made me pause. She said, "Natalie, are you sure this time will be different?" The room went quiet for a second. I asked her what she meant by that. Aunt Karen glanced toward my mother, who was standing near the kitchen, and said, "Your mom told me a few things." Jake was standing beside me. I could feel him tilt his head slightly as he looked at me. I asked what my mother had told her. Aunt Karen said about your past. I immediately understood what she was talking about. Before Jake, I had once been engaged to someone else. We had been together for 5 years. I was 26 at the time. We had already booked the wedding venue and sent out invitations. Everything was almost ready. But 3 months before the wedding, he told me he had met someone else, a coworker from his office. 2 months later, he married her. I will not deny that it broke me for a while. For almost a year, I mostly went to work and then came home. I did not want to see anyone. I did not want to talk about it. But eventually, I moved on. I met Jake about a year and a half later. That was the whole story. But when I looked over at my mother standing in the kitchen that night, I realized she had been telling a different version. Aunt Karen said, "Your mom told me that back then you lost control of your emotions." I turned toward my mother. I asked, "Did you really say that?" My mother did not look at me right away. She said I only told the truth. I asked what exactly she had told people. My mother wiped her hands with a kitchen towel and said, "I told them you went through a very difficult time." I said, "That is not what you just told Aunt Karen." Jake was still standing beside me, silent. Another relative spoke up. They said they had heard that I had been unstable in relationships before. I turned and asked, "Who told you that?" The person shrugged and said, "Your mother is just worried about you." I looked at my mother again. I asked, "How many people have you told these things to?" My mother said she had only told the family. But my family is not small. And the story started spreading faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, I began hearing similar questions from several other people. One aunt called to ask whether I was sure I was thinking clearly when I decided to marry Jake. A cousin said he hoped I was not rushing into things again. An old friend sent me a message asking if I was really okay. At first, I did not understand what was happening. But then Jake said something that made me realize the problem. One evening, while we were having dinner in the kitchen, Jake put his fork down and said, "Natalie, I think your mom is retelling your old story in a different way." I asked him what he meant. Jake said he overheard a few people talking at the gathering the other night. They said you lost emotional control after your previous engagement was called off. They said you have issues in relationships. I looked at Jake for a few seconds. I asked if he really thought my mother had said those things. Jake did not answer right away. He simply said he does not think those people invented that story on their own. I sat quietly for a few seconds. I started remembering the recent phone calls, the slightly hesitant looks from some relatives, the indirect questions that I had not paid attention to before. I said, "Jake, I went through that experience, but I never lost control." Jake nodded. He said he knows. He said he has been with me long enough to know the kind of person I am. But he also said something very direct. He said, "Natalie, if this story keeps spreading the way it is, sooner or later it will come back and affect our wedding." I looked down at the ring on my hand. Just a few weeks earlier, I believed the hardest chapter of my life was already behind me. But I was beginning to realize that for my mother, that story had never truly ended. And this time she was telling it in a way that I had no control over. Things continued to escalate in a very quiet way. There were no big arguments, no dramatic family confrontation, just private conversations that started appearing one by one. One Tuesday morning, Jake told me that my mother had called him. We were standing in the kitchen. I was pouring coffee while Jake leaned back against the counter. He said, "Your mom wants to meet with me." I stopped for a moment. I asked what she said. Jake said she only said she wanted to talk to him privately for a bit. I asked where she wanted to meet. Jake said at a small breakfast place near the highway south of the city. I looked at him for a few seconds and asked if he planned to go. Jake said he thought he should. I said I wanted to go too. Jake shook his head. He said she made it clear she only wanted to talk to him. I set the coffee pot down on the counter. I said I do not like this. Jake nodded. He said he does not like it either, but he wants to know what my mother is thinking. The meeting happened the next morning. I was not there, but Jake told me everything very clearly that night when he came back to the garage. He said the diner was the kind of small roadside place near the highway, with an old sign outside and the strong smell of coffee the moment you walk through the door. My mother was already sitting at a table near the window. Jake walked in and sat across from her. The waitress brought coffee. Neither of them ordered food right away. Jake said my mother did not waste time. She looked at him for a few seconds and then started speaking immediately. She said, "Jake, I know you think you are doing the right thing, but I want you to understand something clearly before this goes any further." Jake asked what that was. My mother set her coffee cup down on the table and said something very direct. She said, "My daughter is already a complicated situation, and you are making the biggest mistake of your life." Jake told me that the diner was fairly quiet at that moment. He did not react right away. He simply looked at my mother for a few seconds. Then he asked one very calm question. He asked whether she was trying to protect Natalie or whether she was trying to stop this wedding. My mother did not answer immediately. She looked out the window for a while. Jake said he thought she was waiting for him to say something else, but he did not. He just sat there quietly. Finally, my mother said she is my mother. She said she had seen how broken I was after my previous engagement ended. She said she did not want to see that happen again. Jake asked whether she believed he was the kind of man who would break me. My mother did not answer directly. She only said sometimes the problem is not the man. Jake said he understood what that meant. He asked whether she believed Natalie was unstable. My mother still did not answer directly. She only said that sometimes a responsible mother has to say things that other people are afraid to say. Jake told me he looked at her for a long time. Then he said only one sentence. He said, "Natalie already told me about her past. I know what happened. And I know how she got through it." My mother stayed silent. Jake said he added one more sentence. He said, "If you are trying to protect Natalie, then I respect that. But if you are trying to stop this wedding, then I think you should say it directly." My mother did not respond. The conversation ended fairly quickly after that. They finished their coffee. No one raised their voice. There was no argument. Jake stood up, paid the bill, and left the diner. When Jake told me the story that night, he was sitting on the wooden chair in the garage, slowly turning a wrench in his hand. I asked him if my mother had really said those exact words. Jake nodded. He said every single word. I stood there for a moment. I did not know if I should feel angry or sad. Jake looked at me and said something very gently. He said he does not think my mother hates him. I asked then what he thinks she is doing. Jake said he thinks she is trying to decide whether this wedding should happen or not. I looked down at the ring on my hand, and for the first time since Jake proposed, I started wondering what else my mother might do to interfere with this. That afternoon, I was in the storage room behind the sporting goods store. A new shipment of running shoes had just arrived. I was checking the product codes when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my jacket. "Kyle. My younger brother almost never calls during work hours," I answered. Kyle's voice was lowered from the very first second. "Natalie, are you free right now?" I said, "I am at the store. What is going on?" Kyle said, "Check your email right now." I asked what happened. Kyle only said one thing. "Just open your email first." The way he said it made me stop immediately. I set the shoebox down on the floor, pulled out my phone, and opened my inbox. A message had just been forwarded. The original sender was my mother. The list of recipients was longer than I expected. A few aunts, 2 uncles, several cousins. I opened the email. The content was only a few lines. No explanation, no greeting, just a very brief announcement. "There is a possibility that Natalie's wedding will not take place." I read the sentence a second time. Kyle was still on the line. He asked, "Did you see it?" I said yes. Kyle said the email was sent about an hour ago. I asked how he got it. Kyle said Mom sent it to the family email group, and I am on that list too. I leaned back against the shelf behind me. I asked, has anyone replied yet? Kyle said a few people had already replied, asking what was going on. But our mother had not responded yet. I looked back at the screen on my phone. The wording was cold, very calm, like a weather announcement. There was no emotion in it at all. Kyle added one more thing. He said, I thought you should know early. I asked him what he thinks Mom is doing. Kyle was silent for a few seconds. Then he said Mom is not just opposing the wedding. I asked what he thinks she is doing. Kyle said she is preparing everyone to believe there is something wrong with this wedding. I did not answer right away. I read the email one more time. The words were still the same. Nothing had changed. But this time I began to understand the meaning behind it. I hung up the phone after a few minutes. The box of shoes was still open on the floor. I did not continue checking inventory. That evening I drove to Jake's garage. The garage door was open. Jake was changing a tire on a large truck. I leaned against his workbench and waited until he finished. Jake rolled the tire aside, wiped his hands with a rag, and looked at me. He said, you look like you just read bad news. I handed him my phone. I said, read this. Jake read the email for a few seconds. He did not react immediately. He set the phone down on the metal table and leaned back against the workbench. I asked him what he thought. Jake said, your mom is talking to more people than we realized. I said, she is talking to the whole family. Jake nodded. He said, and she is not telling the story the way you do. I asked what she is doing then. Jake thought for a few seconds. He said, when someone starts sending emails like this to the entire family, it usually means they are preparing the narrative ahead of time. I looked at him. I asked, preparing for what? Jake answered very directly, preparing for the possibility that this wedding will not happen. I stood there quietly for a few seconds. I looked down at the ring on my hand. Just a few weeks earlier, we were still calculating the guest list and an $18,000 budget for a small wedding farm outside the city. Back then, everything was simple, but now I was beginning to realize that the story had already turned in a different direction. I said something to Jake that even surprised me when I heard it come out of my own mouth. I said, my mom is not just opposing the wedding anymore. Jake looked at me. I said she is preparing to destroy it. Jake did not argue. He only nodded very slowly. And in that moment I knew we were no longer dealing with a worried mother trying to protect her daughter. We were facing a plan that had already begun to unfold. 5 days before the wedding, I was at the store when the landline rang. The caller introduced herself as someone from the wedding farm where we had booked the venue. The woman's voice on the other end sounded careful. She said, Natalie, I am calling to confirm the cancellation of your contract this morning. I stood still for a few seconds. I asked her what she just said. She repeated it again. Your wedding contract was canceled this morning following a phone request. I looked at the calendar hanging on the wall behind the register. I said I have not canceled anything. There was a brief silence on the other end. The woman said, but we received the call from your phone number. I said that cannot be right. I never called. She said the caller introduced herself as Natalie Brooks and requested the contract be canceled immediately. She said she would check the system and call me back. The call ended a few minutes later. I stood behind the register with my mind completely blank. 5 days before the wedding is not the moment anyone cancels a venue. I called Jake. He was at the garage. I said, Jake, the farm just called. They said our contract was canceled this morning. Jake was quiet for a few seconds and then asked, did you call them? I said no. Jake said, I am coming to the store. 15 minutes later, he walked in. I handed him my phone. By then, the farm had already sent the call information back. Jake looked at the screen for a few seconds. He did not say anything immediately. I asked, what is it? Jake handed the phone back to me. He said, look at the phone number. I looked down. The number was so familiar that I did not need to think about it. It was my mother's phone number. I looked up at Jake. I asked, do you think it could be a mistake? Jake shook his head. He said the farm told us the caller introduced herself as Natalie Brooks and asked them to cancel the contract immediately. I stood there for a few seconds. I remembered the email from a few days earlier, the stories my mother had been telling relatives, the meeting between her and Jake at the breakfast diner. Everything started fitting together. Jake said, I will call the farm right now. I nodded. Jake called and put the phone on speaker. He told them that we had never canceled the contract and that we needed to know exactly where the call that morning had come from. The farm manager said they had saved the phone number in their system. Jake asked again, "Which number was it?" The manager read each digit slowly. There was no mistake. Jake ended the call. He set the phone down on the table. I asked if they could restore the contract. Jake said they told us that if we confirm today, they can still keep the venue for us. I nodded. But Jake still did not take his eyes off the phone. He said something very directly. He said, "I think it is time to talk to your mother." I understood what he meant, but I shook my head. Jake looked at me for a few seconds. He asked, "Are you sure?" I said, "Not yet." Jake said she just called and canceled our wedding venue. I said, "I know." Jake said if we do not talk to her right now, she will keep doing things like this. I looked down at the ring on my hand. I said, "I know." Jake waited for me to continue. I took a breath and said only one word. "Not yet." Jake did not say anything else. But from the look in his eyes, I knew he understood that this was only the first strike. One day after the wedding farm incident, that morning I had just opened the store when my phone vibrated. The DJ, he said he needed to confirm something. He had just received notice that the wedding had been canceled. I stood still for a few seconds. "The wedding has not been canceled." There was silence on the other end. He said the caller introduced herself as Natalie Brooks. I looked down at the screen of my phone, the same phone number. I told him to keep the booking. The call ended. 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. The caterer. The same question. The same story. They had received notice that the reception was no longer happening. I looked out through the front glass of the store. Outside, the traffic was moving normally. Inside my head, nothing was normal. I confirmed the contract again. They kept the date. By the afternoon, more calls started coming in. A friend asked what was going on. A relative said they heard the wedding might have been canceled. The rumors started spreading faster than I expected. No one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone had heard something. That night, I drove to Jake's garage. He was standing beside a truck with the hood open. I told him everything that had happened during the day. The wedding farm, the DJ, the caterer, the rumors among the guests. Jake listened, then closed the hood of the truck. He wiped his hands with a rag. One very short sentence. "Your mom is taking the wedding apart piece by piece." I nodded. Not one single attack, but step by step. The farm, the music, the food, the rumors. Jake leaned back against the workbench, looked at me for a moment, then asked, "What do you want to do?" I looked down at the ring on my hand. 5 days until the wedding. 200 guests. A small wedding farm outside the city. An $18,000 budget. All of it was being taken apart piece by piece. I said one sentence. "Let her believe she has already won." Jake looked at me. He did not say anything for a few seconds. Then he nodded slightly. "If your mom thinks she has already done enough damage, she will stop." I said exactly. And for the first time since all of this started, we were no longer chasing after everything my mother was doing. We let her believe her plan was working. 2 days after the wedding farm cancellation, a new plan began forming in a place no one in my family would ever expect. Jake's garage was quiet that night. The rolling door was half open, cold air drifting in from the street carrying the familiar smell of metal and engine oil. I was sitting on the wooden chair beside Jake's workbench while he was talking with an older man standing near the door. Marcus. Marcus had been Jake's boss many years ago, a tall man with nearly all gray hair, his voice always deep and slow. He owned a large woodworking shop on the south side of Colorado Springs, where Jake used to work before opening his own garage. Jake quickly told Marcus the whole story. The wedding farm, the phone call canceling the contract, the DJ, the caterer, the rumors beginning to spread through my family. Marcus listened to everything without interrupting once. He simply stood there with his arms crossed, leaning against the old metal table in the garage. When Jake finished, Marcus nodded slowly. "Then hold the wedding at my place." Jake looked at him. "Where?" Marcus said, "In the wood shop." He said it very simply, like he was suggesting moving a table across the room. Jake frowned slightly. Marcus said his shop was big enough for a few hundred people, But if we only needed a small wedding, it would be even easier. No fancy decorations needed, just clean the space. Jake turned and looked at me. I had never imagined having a wedding inside a woodworking shop. But when Marcus said it, the idea sounded strangely reasonable. No one in my family knew about this plan. No contract anyone could call to cancel. No list of vendors my mother could contact. Just a large wood shop. Marcus added one more sentence. He said wood smells better than wedding flowers anyway. Jake laughed quietly. I looked at Marcus. He was not joking. I asked how big his shop was. Marcus said big enough to fit an 18-wheeler truck inside, so a wedding should not be a problem. I looked at Jake. Jake looked at me. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then I nodded. But there was one thing we agreed on immediately after that. This plan had to stay secret. Jake pulled a piece of paper from the workbench and started writing down names. Not the list of 200 guests we originally planned. Only the people who truly needed to be there. The people we knew were on our side. Marcus, Kyle, two of Jake's closest friends, one aunt of mine that I trust, a few others. In the end, the list stopped at 15. A 200-guest wedding had turned into 15, but this time no one on that list could call and cancel my wedding. Marcus said one last thing before leaving the garage. Do not worry about the place. Just show up on time. I looked at Jake after Marcus left. Jake leaned back against the workbench, his arms crossed. He said very calmly, "If your mom thinks she has already won, she will stop sabotaging things." I nodded. That was exactly what we needed. For her to believe the wedding had collapsed, when in reality, it had simply moved somewhere she would never know about. On the morning of the wedding, nearly 200 guests began arriving at the farm outside Colorado Springs. The parking lot filled with cars quickly, people dressed in formal clothes, holding envelopes, taking photos in front of the wooden gate of the farm like any other wedding. But only a few minutes later, the confusion began to spread. The farm gate was locked, no staff preparing the reception, no tables, no chairs, no flowers. The farm manager stood near the entrance, repeating the same sentence to every new group of guests who arrived. The wedding contract had been canceled earlier. Some people began calling me. Others called Jake. Messages appeared continuously on my phone. What is happening? Is the wedding really canceled? I was standing about 30 minutes away, inside Marcus's wood shop. The space was wide, and the smell of freshly cut wood filled the air. A long row of tables had already been arranged. Simple hanging lights above, no elaborate flowers, no elegant backdrop, just a large woodworking shop that had been cleaned and prepared. Jake looked at his watch and said it was time. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. 15 people we trusted were inside the shop watching him leave. I stood near the door, hearing the engines of the buses outside. 3 large buses were already waiting. Jake drove back to the wedding farm. By the time he arrived, the parking lot was almost full. Guests stood in small groups talking nervously. Some people were already preparing to leave. Jake stepped out of the bus. Several people recognized him immediately. The air went quiet for a few seconds. Jake climbed onto the step of the first bus so everyone could see him. He spoke loudly enough for the entire parking lot to hear. The wedding is still happening. Some people looked at each other. A few laughed because they thought he was joking. Jake continued. The original venue was canceled, but the wedding is still happening. I just need everyone to trust us for 10 more minutes. A few laughs came from the back of the crowd. One of Jake's friends started clapping first, then a few others joined. Jake pointed toward the 3 buses waiting nearby. He said we prepared another plan. If everyone is willing, the buses will take you to the new location. Some guests looked at each other and laughed. Someone shouted from the back of the parking lot, "This is the most interesting opening to a wedding I have ever seen." Jake jumped down from the bus step. The first person to get on the bus was an old friend of mine from college. Then a few more followed. It did not take long for the confusion to turn into curiosity. Groups of guests began boarding the buses. No one asked many questions anymore. They just wanted to see what would happen next. The 3 buses slowly left the parking lot of the wedding farm. About 20 minutes later, the buses stopped in front of a large metal building on the south side of the city. Marcus's wood shop. When the bus doors opened, the smell of fresh wood drifted through the air. Inside, the lights were already on. Tables and chairs were arranged. And at the far end of the woodshop, I was standing there waiting. No luxurious wedding flowers. No elaborate backdrop. But the wedding was still happening. And this time, no one could call to cancel it anymore. When the 3 buses left the wedding farm, most of the guests followed Jake, but not all of them. A few people stayed behind in the parking lot, talking quietly among themselves. My mother was one of them. Darlene stood near the farm gate, with her arms folded across her chest. She looked around the empty property. The gate still locked. No reception tables. No flowers. No music. A few relatives nearby were whispering to each other. My mother caught fragments of their conversation. It looked like the wedding had really been canceled. It looked like Natalie and Jake had failed to pull it together in time. I was not there, but later I was told the scene very clearly. My mother stood in front of the gate for quite a while. She looked across the parking lot, then watched the farm manager locking the office door. To her, the scene meant only one thing. The plan had worked, but there was one detail she did not know. Among the relatives standing in that parking lot was someone who belonged to the group of 15 people who knew the real plan. It was one of my cousins. When my mother asked him what was going on, he answered casually. He said the wedding was still happening somewhere else. My mother turned to him immediately. Where? My cousin realized he had just said more than he intended, but it was already too late to take the words back. He gave her an address. Marcus's woodshop. My mother left the wedding farm almost immediately. 40 minutes later, her car stopped in front of the large woodshop on the south side of Colorado Springs. When she walked inside, the ceremony had already begun. Inside the woodshop, nearly 200 guests were standing around the center of the room. The hanging lights above reflected softly on the freshly cut wood. There were no elaborate decorations, only rows of chairs and tables arranged neatly along the sides. And in the middle of the room, I was standing with a microphone in my hand. Kyle stood beside a large screen that Marcus normally used to display construction designs in the shop. When the door opened, a few people turned around. I also saw my mother walk in. But I did not stop. I held the microphone and looked around the room. I said many people here have heard different stories about me over the past few weeks. The atmosphere in the shop grew quieter. I said some people believe I am not ready to get married. A few guests began glancing at one another. I continued. So before the ceremony begins, I think everyone should hear that story from the person who has been telling it. I turned toward Kyle. Kyle nodded. The screen behind me lit up. On the screen was an email, the same email my mother had sent to several people in our family. The message contained only one line. There is a possibility that Natalie's wedding will not take place. A few people in the room began whispering to each other. Kyle moved to the next slide. Messages, phone calls, cancellation notices, the wedding farm, the DJ, the caterer. Piece by piece, the wedding had been taken apart. The room grew quieter. Kyle pressed the remote once more. A recording began to play through the speakers. It was the conversation between Jake and my mother at the roadside diner. My mother's voice echoed clearly through the woodshop. My daughter is already a lost cause, and you are making the biggest mistake of your life. No one spoke after that sentence. Nearly 200 people stood still. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the projector. And for the first time in weeks, the entire story was heard from beginning to end, not through anyone else's version. After the recording ended, the room inside the woodshop remained silent longer than anyone expected. Only the warm yellow lights hanging high above reflecting off the fresh wooden boards, and nearly 200 people standing still in the same moment. Kyle muted the projector, but the screen behind me remained lit. I held the microphone in my hand and looked around the room. Familiar faces, relatives, friends, co-workers, all of them watching me. But my eyes stopped on one person. My mother. Darlene stood near the entrance of the shop, only a few meters away from me. She did not say anything. Her face no longer carried the same certainty it had when she walked in. Over the past few weeks, she had told many stories about me. She said I was not ready for marriage. She said Jake was making a mistake. She said this wedding would end in disaster. And for one brief moment, when the gate at the wedding farm was locked, she believed she had been right. But now everything stood in front of her. I took a slow breath. My heart was beating fast, but when I spoke, my voice was strangely calm. I looked directly at her and said, "I do not hate you." A few people in the room shifted slightly. Someone exhaled. Someone lowered their eyes to the wooden floor. I continued, slowly and clearly, "But I will not let you decide my life anymore." There was no applause. Only a very real silence. And that silence said more than any words could. My mother stood there for a few seconds. She looked around the room, at the relatives who had once listened to her stories about me, at the family, friends, at Jake standing beside me. Then she turned and walked away. No one stopped her. No one said anything. She stepped outside and the woodshop door closed quietly behind her. I remained standing there for a few seconds longer. Not because I expected her to come back, only because I knew a chapter of my life had just ended. Kyle walked over and turned off the projector completely. The light in the woodshop softened. Jake stepped closer to me. He did not say anything. He simply took my hand and squeezed it gently. A small gesture, but enough for me to realize I was no longer standing alone. Marcus stepped forward from behind us, patted Jake lightly on the shoulder, and signaled to the band. A slow guitar melody began to echo through the wide space of the woodshop. People started to move. Some pulled their chairs closer. Some smiled at me as they walked past. It was not the perfect wedding we had imagined in the beginning. There was no large flower arch at the farm, no long rows of elaborately decorated tables, no wide meadow glowing under the sunset. But there was something more important than all of those things. The wedding was still happening. Jake was still standing beside me. And the people who truly cared about us were still here. The officiant stepped forward. He held a small notebook and began reading the opening words of the ceremony. I looked around the room one more time. The warm yellow lights above, tall stacks of wood lined along the walls, the smell of freshly cut pine in the air, and nearly 200 people standing a little closer together inside that space. When Jake took my hand and we walked toward the center of the room, I realized something I had never fully understood before. For many years, I had always felt like I was living inside a story that someone else had written for me. Judgments, twisted versions of events, decisions made on my behalf. I had always believed my past would follow me forever. But in that moment, standing in a room filled with light and with people who chose to stay, I realized the past had finally stopped behind me. The officiant began reading the vows. Jake looked at me and smiled softly. I smiled back. Not the tense smile I had carried through the past few weeks, but a quiet smile of relief. And for the first time in many years, I felt something simple but powerful. My life finally belonged to me. Some family stories do not begin with loud arguments. They begin with small sentences, with stories retold slightly differently, with phone calls that seem harmless at first. And sometimes it takes a long time before someone realizes that a story about their life is being told in a way they never controlled. The hardest part is not when strangers misunderstand you. The hardest part is when that misunderstanding comes from someone in your own family. When a person has to stand between their family and their own life, no choice feels easy. Not everyone wants a confrontation. Many people simply want peace. They want to keep harmony. They want to believe that eventually everything will settle on its own. But sometimes silence allows a story to go further than it should. Sometimes a person has to stand up and speak the truth clearly, not to defeat anyone, but simply to reclaim the right to live their own life. In stories like this, what people remember the longest is not the criticism or the sabotage. What people remember is usually the moment when someone stands calmly in the middle of a room full of people and says what needs to be said. No shouting, no revenge. Just quietly setting a boundary for their own life. And sometimes that alone is enough to change everything. Not every family is the same. Not every story ends the same way. But there is one moment that appears again and again in many real-life stories. It is the moment when someone realizes that the past no longer has the authority to decide their future, and from that moment forward, they begin to move ahead in their own way. If you have listened this far, this story may have reminded you of a moment in your own life. Situations inside families are often more complicated than anything else. If you would like to hear more stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next ones. And if you would like, leave a small comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I read those comments. Many news stories sometimes begin from the simplest things people choose to share.